There are, believe it or not, people who think that Australia is doing the wrong thing by sending Australians who have been caught up in Wuhan in China in the coronavirus to Christmas Island. These are the people who would have a problem with the Prime Minister curing cancer or anyone who voted Liberal having a good idea. But these people do not understand the gravity of the situation that the world is currently in. If you think, by the way, that is hyperbole from me on a talk show here on television, let me turn your attention to what the World Health Organization said today about coronavirus. It was reported by the BBC that the whole world must take action. It was also reported by, among others, let's keep moving here, guys, The Guardian, that the whole world must be ready to deal with coronavirus, says the World Health Organization. Here on Taxpayer TV, coronavirus transmission between humans of grave concern. In the United States, even business publications were talking about the grave concern. These words aren't thrown around to panic people. It's because this is serious. And that's why we are lucky that as we are when it comes to border security, we are an island nation. We can take steps to stop people marching over the borders illegally via boats. It's something that doesn't exist in Europe. It doesn't exist in the United States. It doesn't exist in big parts of Asia. But as the island continent, we have the ability to keep things a good couple of 100 kilometres away. We are able to have a giant natural moat around our country to make sure that this stuff can try to be held away for as far as possible. So that's why the Australian government has decided that we will go to China and we will give people who are only visiting China, it's not some sort of backdoor way of grabbing extra people who want to jump on the plane and get out of China. It's people who are Australians who have been visiting in China, that they will be able to come back to Australia. But just as it is with kids who went on holidays in China, just as it is with tourists who've been in China, people are being told you have to stay at home for 2 weeks. It makes perfect sense that the people who are in the absolute epicentre of the coronavirus in Wuhan in China will come back to Australia but will go to a medical facility that has been created on Christmas Island. Now, this is not going to be a prison. This is not going to be a place where people will not be allowed out of their cells, etc., etc. Now, sure, it's not a 5-star resort, but if the option was 2 weeks in the freedom and protection of constant monitoring in Australia versus the let's see what happens in China, what would you do if it was your family? Now, inevitably, there will be some smarty pants in the next couple of days that will turn around and say there's some sort of bizarre racial content to this or it's somehow offending China. Did you miss the bit where the World Health Organization has said that the world has to take action? That this is of grave concern? Now, I hope that the worst that this country's exposure to all of this is those people who come in that plane, and of course they should have to pay their own way to come back, because then everyone else will be blowing up about the free flights home, etc., etc. So those people will go somewhere where they can be safe for 2 weeks. They can be monitored, that if they start to show signs, they can be pulled away from everyone else so the people who don't have coronavirus can leave as soon as possible. It's common sense. It's not politics. It's not an overreaction. It's not some subtle racial dog whistle and all this other garbage that people scream. And they scream it because they don't like the people who are responsible for how this country responds to it. These are the people who are ignoring Australians' deep interest and potential fear in what's going on here. Online websites, which are often the clickbait and beat-up media of this country, all week. Regardless, with the one exception, of course, of Kobe Bryant, the most read story every hour of every day on almost every news site has been about coronavirus. Parents are concerned, travellers are concerned, and all of us are concerned. So yet again, while we were all blessed by luck to be born into a country that has a giant moat around it, one of the many advantages are that we have smaller islands that we can use for 2 weeks. So settle down if you are one of those who are getting a little over the top. There is, however, a bigger problem that has nothing to do with Wuhan and nothing to do with Christmas Island. It is about the people who have already travelled from China to somewhere else and the somewhere else to here. Now, as you know, British Airways is not flying to China anymore. IKEA is shutting down its stores in China. Starbucks is shutting down many of its stores in China. McDonald's the same. Why? Because they know that this thing is, at a certain point in time, until we know how to deal with it, you have to assume the absolute worst of this. So it was frankly frightening today to read the story that a person has made their way to the Gold Coast, but it was a very indirect way to the Gold Coast. And that person took a flight from Melbourne to the Gold Coast, and about 200 people didn't know that they were on a flight with somebody who had been in the areas and actually is now a suspected case of coronavirus in Australia. The Chief Medical Officer in Queensland is the one who was explaining the situation.
We are going to be contacting every single passenger on the flight. We believe it had around 150 to 200 passengers, but we're getting confirmation on that. We'll contact every single passenger and give them information. And then those passengers that were sitting 2 rows in front and behind of this cohort, once we've managed to get their seats and sorted all that out, we'll be asking them to go into isolation.
Okay, but what about the air conditioning that means that if somebody's coughing at the front of the plane, you'll end up breathing something towards the back of the plane at some point during the 1.5 hour journey between Melbourne and the Gold Coast? 2.5 hour journey. How do we not know exactly the flight? We only know the date. We know that there was a Tiger Airways flight, but it was one that happened a few days ago. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need to cut off all flights to China. Clearly not. But anyone who has a travel record of going through China, well, they're going to have to be screened. And they can be screened at the airports. Apparently this person went from China to Singapore, from Singapore to Melbourne, from Melbourne to the Gold Coast. There clearly is an opportunity for us to be able to stop as much of this at the border as we possibly can. And I repeat, for those who think that people are just trying to distract or scare or all that other rubbish that's going to be said, I repeat, the World Health Organization has said that this is of grave concern. Normal people are understandably anxious about this. That said, and very importantly, you need to know this, that those who are trying to say nasty things about the Chinese community, you people are lowlifes. There will be plenty of celebrations for the Lunar New Year, Chinese New Year, and Hung Hai Fat Choi will be said in many parts of the country over the weekend. And I'm very pleased to know that our country's leaders will be turning up in those communities to show that it is about trying to make sure that we can have as normal interactions with all different types of people while taking the precautions with those that have come from China. That's what all of this is about, and anyone who tries to change the subject to something else is doing it for the lowest of political reasons.